queuing up the questions for
From
you.
the Zoom.
Yeah, so she can
cities we
that and she'll you know, she'll
From spring break, thanks for joining us today.
think, you know.
We all had a restful time and nice it's here. I am really excited to present today's speakers, Professor Sophie Bacq and Professor Tom Lumpkin. Professor Bacq is actually here at IU. She's associate professor and the Larry and Barbara Sharp professor in management and entrepreneurship department in the Kelley School. Tom Lumpkin is a professor emeritus of entrepreneurship at Oklahoma University's Price College of Business, and also I've learned a senior visiting scholar at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Actually, where one of our former workshoppers, Emma McDowell, is now a professor. So that's very exciting. Their work explores the drivers of social entrepreneurship, and in particular, the importance of analysis at the community level. So you'll know we're sort of really dear and near to the really core of Ostrom kinds of levels of analysis and ideas. So this is really exciting. Their work has been really widely published. And something I learned, and I hope it's not too much, that I thought was really, really wonderful, is that prior to becoming a professor, Professor Lumpkin was an assistant treasurer of the city of Fairfax, is that in Virginia? And also worked at a variety of different startups. And so I thought that was really wonderful. So when we're talking about social entrepreneurship and sort of small business innovation, we really have, couldn't imagine a better pair of co-authors. So today's discussion is really going to focus on their book project, is my understanding. Yes. That will sort of be based on the paper that was posted to the website, Civic, Wealth Creation, a New View of Stakeholder Engagement and Societal Impact. Today's talk, Civic Wealth Creation, Linking Collective Action and Entrepreneurship, is sort of this conversation about the larger book project. So I'm really looking forward to it. As usual, clarifying questions during the presentation. I will keep a queue, however, after the fact for the real deal set of questions and discussion. All right, so welcome, you guys.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all just right after spring break. It's a delight, it's an honor to be here to present our joint work that's based off this article, which was circulated by the Ostrom Workshop team, Civic Wealth Creation, a New View of Stakeholder Engagement and Societal Impact. And so what we want to do with the 15 minutes that we've been allocated is to give you the basics, the summary of this work, if you haven't had a chance to read it, or just clarify any of the principles, and then open up conversation on what we're trying to achieve in our current work in progress book by linking collective action to entrepreneurship. We're both entrepreneurship scholars, as was mentioned, and been educated and grown up in the business school. So this is a great opportunity to hear interdisciplinary views on this work that's really dear to us. So civic wealth creation, that's really quotes from the article, is a term that's used to describe what occurs when different kinds of actors, and here I'll show you a framework in a few minutes. These actors, we've categorized them in three kinds: communities, entrepreneurs, and supporters of local initiatives coalesce to improve their well-being and vitality through cooperation, kinship, and commerce. And so the creation of civic wealth refers to the generation of different kinds of endowments, social, economic, communal, that aim at the end of the day eventually to benefit local communities. And we'll give you examples as well that we're working on and weaving through our. And so civic wealth as such, not the creation of it, but civic wealth is used as a broad indicator of the intellectual, affective, and material resources, capabilities, and capacities of a segment of society. So here's the background, like how we came up with this idea and this framework that was eventually published. I will not go into details on the 7 years that went in through the publication process of that work. You can ask questions about it if that's of any interest. Really, the concept of civic wealth creation emerged from our joint work on social entrepreneurship. So if you're not familiar with the concept, It's the practice of addressing social problems, societal problems, including environmental problems, by means of market mechanisms. We found ourselves asking, what really are social entrepreneurs trying to achieve, in particular, by contrast to traditional commercial entrepreneurs? Why is it that we have this new category of entrepreneurs? What are they trying to do? And so what we found in our research is that a lot of these social entrepreneurs aim at bringing in positive social change at the community level. Eventually, they're trying to improve the well-being of their communities or communities they're in some ways attached to. And so as we're thinking this through, we realized that civic wealth was addressing societal impact more broadly. That was not just an initiative of social entrepreneurs. Even though social entrepreneurs are creating what we would characterize as civic wealth, there are many initiatives around the globe that are currently engaging in civic wealth creation. So we removed most references to social entrepreneurship in the article. Through the 7 years, we had a couple of versions circulating. And we really stayed true to the core principle that was there from the beginning of our thinking and research, which is that entrepreneurship and enterprising remain key components in this model. We emphasized also the role of multiple actors that are working together to achieve civic wealth creation and positive social change. And so we're currently extending this work into a book. So that's going to be the topic of the conversation today, which is about how to strengthen communities through collective action and entrepreneurship. And so I told you about the 3 categories of stakeholders. So I'll give you a few examples. So one is enterprise. And so the enterprises we're talking about, and that Tom will give you a few examples of, are any kind. So they can be for-profit or social businesses, right? So having a for-profit structure with a primary social purpose, nonprofit ventures, community or community-based enterprises, and also cooperatives, but not only. The communities we're talking about are also of any kind. So we try to be comprehensive within a range of boundaries still, going from neighborhoods to villages in both developing and developed settings, to maybe at a higher scale or level, cities and towns, to, and we're experimenting with that, so any feedback welcome as well, populace that shared conditions or experience. So our thinking of community can be geographic, and in most cases it will be. In the work of Eleanor as well was like highly emphasized this sense of shared locality, but it also could be a shared condition. For instance, individuals with a certain disability who identify as part of the community of people with a hearing disability, for instance, without sharing location or experience. Thinking of the US veterans, like it's a huge community in the United States, they're not sharing necessarily location. Really important, the third category of actor is any supporter to this social change initiative. And so depending on the kind of enterprise and the kind of community, the kinds of supporters will vary. So trying to be inclusive, we consider government agencies, but not so much. And honestly, this is where we also welcome feedback, as we're much more familiar with impact investing funds, high net worth families and individuals, corporations who engage in corporate giving and so on to help enterprises and communities improve their well-being. So the argument, that's another strong argument we make in the paper, is that each of these categories of actors is driven by a particular logic. Right. So what will define an enterprise is not whether they're for-profit, nonprofit. We're trying to be, and we are agnostic about that. It's the fact that they're driven by business and entrepreneurship logics, by a sense of financial self-reliance, profitability prospects, opportunity recognition. The community will be driven by a logic of kinship and citizenry. So that will be shared bonds and affinity, but also a sense of shared responsibility for one another and doing things together, because this is what our citizenry calls us to do. And finally, the regimes of support. Any supporter is driven by a logic of influence and control. They're likely responding to some influence and power, depending on the resources that they have and contributing to the effort, and maybe some sense of legitimacy as well. So our argument is that wealth creation happens at the intersections. So you've seen civic wealth creation pop out here in the middle, where these three categories of actors driven by respective logics of action do come together and act in a cooperative manner. But there are different kinds of wealth that is created, at each of the three intersections on the outer side of the framework. So typically, if you ignore community, if we're just talking about an enterprise connecting forces with regimes of support, economic wealth will be created, right? And so typically it's maybe an international aid with some impact investors that are funding a nonprofit social ventures, and that is creating economic viability. When communities engage with entrepreneurship, so harnessing the potential of entrepreneurship, of commerce and self-reliance, communal wealth is created. And that can go through the ownership of means of productions by, for instance, without any engagements of the regimes of support. And finally, our argument is that social wealth is created where international aid or government agencies help communities without engaging with commerce necessarily, right? So coming in and maybe just distributing services and products without engaging in entrepreneurship. And so when the three categories of actors driven by these three logics come together, our argument is that civic wealth is then created at the intersection of the three. So I'm going to give the floor to Tom, who will take you on for the second part of the presentation.
Okay, so thank you. And for my part, thanks also for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. So I want to sort of share with you what we think of as distinguishing features or almost principles of civic wealth, and to link those in particular to some of the work of Professor Ostrom. So first of all, I think Sophie's presentation has made clear that we're talking about a sort of extra organizational level of analysis, a level of analysis beyond any one type of organization. And so even though we're not really specifically addressing common pool resources, not exactly in what we're doing, we are addressing this idea of common shared values and the idea of collections of people with common interests. And so civic, we feel, was a more useful word than community, because community is sort of just neutral by itself, but civic implies the idea of people that have a shared bond and have some caring about each other. And so it's also interesting to think about this in terms, I think, again, Sophie made it clear that we're talking about sort of from the neighborhood to the region. That's kind of this band of civic that we're talking about, bigger than an organization, not society as at large. And that corresponds to some extent with Professor Ostrom's work, who did talk about the size of some of these initiatives. You know, one person's ceiling is another man's floor. I mean, when you look at her example of, say, the Raymond Basic example, all of the cities that are around a particular water resource, that's rather bigger than what most of what we're looking at. Some of the things that we look at are very sort of neighborhood level scale, but the issue of scale here is something that we try to control with the choice of the word civic as well. There's also the idea of wealth, and like Professor Ostrom, we actually embrace this idea of wealth as something more than money and material possessions. It's stocks of resources, it's assets, and it can include the built environment, the natural environment, cultural capital, political capital, social capital. And so we think of wealth in a sort of larger sense, a total wealth perspective. These things, such as political capital or natural resources, are things that can be leveraged to make societal improvements as well. With regard to the third of these, this idea of entrepreneurship as central to what we're proposing here, and again, what we've observed in our research on social entrepreneurship. Of course, Professor Ostrom talks about entrepreneurs in various contexts relative to the theory of firm and that sort of thing. And we also feel like it's important to sort of put forth entrepreneurs here as another actor who has both an important role, but also a certain amount of power. They bring legitimacy, they bring financial stability. In Governing the Commons, Professor Ostrom both begins the book and ends the book with a sort of lament about how often people sort of turn to the government as the solution to how these things are going to get done. In the final analysis, if we can't figure it out, the government will tell us what to do. And yet, what we have found and what we're seeing in these examples is entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship as a sort of an additional sort of authority, if you will, because of the financial legitimacy that they bring to it in making these things happen. So that's an important feature of ours that's relatively different from her work. And then there's this idea of stakeholder involvement. We use stakeholder theory as our primary theoretical framework for in the paper. And we mention in that respect both the engagement of beneficiaries and also the importance of linking multiple stakeholders with diverse backgrounds, diverse motivations, but joint interests, but common interests. And we think that's an important part of this. This idea of stakeholder cooperation is stakeholders voluntarily come together in order to make a difference in their communities. And so you don't so much see intentionality in Professor Ostrom's work as much as you do organizing and commitment, for example. These ideas are present in her conversations about how to make this work. And so that is, again, part of this. There is an intentionality behind what we're seeing that is present in these examples. And then finally, the engagement of beneficiaries just speaks to the importance of involving people at every level of the process, people having a voice in this. It's kind of a co-production concept, if you will, in the sense of their involvement is crucial for successful outcomes. You can't just do something for the beneficiaries and drop it. They have to be engaged from the very beginning. And again, the more successful projects that we see are part of what we're working with here. And so we welcome your feedback on what I just said about how these links to the work of Professor Ostrom make sense and work out. But let me share a few examples. So the Boston Ujima project, the Ujima actually is a word similar to Civic. It means collective work and responsibility. It's one of the Kwanzaa concepts. And this is a minority community in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston that found that they were not able to get the funding and the financial support that they needed in order to create projects in these areas that were either food deserts or other, sort of desert neighborhoods. And so what they did was they were able to leverage their cultural capital initially with a crowdfunding kind of a campaign. They were able to leverage their social capital. They were eventually able, because they got traction, to leverage their political capital. And so, in other words, they sort of came around to being able to obtain financial resources in ways that other people find easy to do by leveraging these other kinds of wealth. And in the process, they were able to economically empower this working class community, minority community that they represent in Boston. Then there's this idea of, and by the way, the Boston Ujima project was initiated by the community. As you can imagine, we had these communities, enterprises, supporters. Somebody usually has to be the prime mover, the first actor in order to get these going. Well, Ujima project is interesting because they don't identify any particular founder or any particular head. It was from the start, it was a community level project. Water for People, entirely different setting and context. This is actually an NGO initiated project, right? So Water for People, we like this example because although there's many agencies that are involved in trying to address water and sanitation problems, these folks have the attitude that they don't go into a community, and they operate in like India, Africa, South America. They don't usually go into a community until they have the buy-in from the members of the community. They have the local leaders, the local business people, the teachers and parents, because often these things are linked to the schools in a community. And until they have financial buy-in, but also a commitment to maintain these systems, they will not go into a community. And once they do, their involvement is to get it all set up, to provide technical analysis and some financial support, and then to leave, right? And so they exemplify this idea of all the players in a community must be involved. And they have, in the process, improved health and safety, and also created this notions of greater self-sufficiency. And then the Beyond Good, this would be an enterprise-led example. And so Beyond Good was founded by a couple of fellows who were Peace Corps volunteers in Madagascar. They were spending their time in Africa, and if you consider Madagascar part of Africa, they became aware that something on the neighborhood of 65% of the people 65% of the world's chocolate, cocoa comes from Africa, and the average African person has not ever had a chocolate bar. And so they decided that they ought to do something about that. Madagascar actually has a genetically unique flavored cocoa. And so they built a production facility in Madagascar to make chocolate bars, which employed local people. It included a conservation project to protect the trees, the sensitive trees environmentally, and of course, created a commercial success that gave people employment, economic stability, and higher standards of living. So these are examples of civic wealth creation that we're talking about. In terms of the book, and in terms of what we hope to get feedback from you about, we're exploring and finding examples of this idea of linking civic wealth creation with linking collective action and entrepreneurship. And so there are a number of issues, as you can imagine. For example, this idea of overcoming power differences. If you think about the actors that we've talked about, beneficiaries, people who are in need, maybe in disadvantaged communities, and, powerful people with money, or governments that feel like they have the right to, create systems for them. You can imagine that there are a lot of power differences in how those actors are able to work together in order to make things happen. Do the beneficiaries really get a voice in how things are done, or are the power differences so great that maybe they don't really have as strong an engagement or as involvement? And how to overcome those power differences is one of the questions that we're exploring in our examples and are trying to understand better. A future research topic, for one thing. Then there's the idea of ownership implications and how to manage them. So much of what Professor Ostrom talked about involved cooperatives and co-ops. We envision a lot of different kinds of ownership settings, and not just the legal form of ownership that I'm talking about here, but also, if you have an initiative that brings together all these diverse stakeholders and creates a thing, right? Whether it's a new community center or a new enterprise or a water system in a remote region of India. How is the ownership of that managed, and what are the implications of ownership, both in terms of who has authority over it, who controls it, but also in this idea of, well, nobody has authority over it and controls it. It's a community resource, or maybe even a public good. And then the idea identifying design principles for the context that we're talking about. So again, Professor Ostrom, one of her outcomes of some of the research was to propose design principles that were related to things about boundaries, choice, congruence, conflict resolution. All of these are topics that those folks who are engaging in civic wealth creation are also attempting to address. And so as we're doing interviews, we're actually going to interview the Boston Ujima folks this afternoon. As we interview different people, as we look at these different settings and examples, we're asking them and we're asking ourselves, what is working? What are the design principles that have been effective in pulling these things together? And so with that, I think we've used up our time. We welcome any kind of feedback that you have, suggestions for improvement, and happy to take your questions.
All right, so thank you so much. That was really wonderful, very clear, and really wonderful. Sorry, I'm talking. Thank you. I think Bernie, I think Bernie was first, and then Gustavo, and then Mike.
Workshopper you ought to be in contact with is Joe Bahati, Uganda.
Okay.
He's involved in their Banana Industrial Research and Development Center. He was here last year for like 3 months. Great example.
Great, thank you.
Try to figure out how to, as a community with co-ops, when take bananas that you can't ship a banana, but you can process it and ship it in other ways. It's a good example. Look him up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
BAHATI.
BH.
BAHATI.
Got it right.
I can help online too, Jess, if you need it, or if you have it
I
up.
think we don't have any yet online,
Okay.
so we're
Cool.
I think Gustavo is next after, unless you respond.
Yeah, we got it.
Thank you for that.
So I was thinking we can expand on the idea of when all these interactions work in the direction of creating total wealth, and when those interactions work in the direction of, in the opposite direction, to maximize rent seeking, for example, or political patronage. I can give you a lot of examples from Latin America that would perfectly fit your system, but essentially works to maximize political patronage. So for example, that's exactly what drug cartels are doing in some places. They are in the middle between, community recruiting, providing some social security to the people, financing political campaigns. But they're also responsible for, a lot of homicides and violence and problems. So essentially, you see, it's like
Extra now.
it's like at the theoretical level, I think it would be interesting to see, okay, when these interactions operate in the right direction, when they operate in the wrong directions.
Yeah, that's a good thing to look at generally. Is it your view, if I can just ask you, that the patronage and the things that they do destroys civic wealth?
I think that in order to run networks of patronage, you need a lot of, I wouldn't call it civil wealth, but essentially you need a lot of informal mechanisms, blah, blah, and those connections look pretty similar to the networks of political patronage in many developing countries. So they're like mix of political entrepreneurs and, standard entrepreneurs between, the private sector and the governments. They're operating in that gray area between what is legal and what is illegal, what is the formal sector and what is the informal sector, but in essentially to rent seeking. So it's
I can two-finger on that. It's a slight addition, which is the sort of whether you observe failures. It's slightly different. There's one that's not just consequences, but another would just be the absence of the formation of civic.
that would be
Yes. So the absence of, well, we're well aware that some of these behaviors destroy civic wealth, rather than create civic wealth. And so I think that, trying to understand what the pivot point is and where some of the ideas that we're talking about can actually go bad is an interesting challenge. One of our supporters that we included there was high wealth families, for example, and sometimes families, especially in certain parts of the world, can have corrupt control over local communities, and that we would think would be, in general, would destroy civic wealth, or at least undermine it. It would be a sort of a failure, maybe to Jessica's point. I think also, I'm studying a case in Berea, Kentucky, where the state government got involved in building this art center that was right next to the interstate, with the idea that it would, lift up all the Appalachian arts, arts and crafts people who were in those hills, and give them. What it did instead was it took all of the commerce away from downtown Berea and from all of those little shops that were over here or there, and that attracted people to come in and spend their money in the town. And now they get, this far off the interstate, and they're spending their money at this big fancy new center. And it has taken away from the civic wealth of the community. And so it's an interesting question and thorny, because you're right, some of the same principles.
Yeah, I think whatever you can say in that direction, I think would be very, very useful.
Thank you for the question. I mean, the dual question there. I think very important, and we're still collecting data on the failed cases in particular. I want to highlight that probably what an assumption or a shared characteristic that stays true to the 3 examples that Tom presented and other examples we've been using, and that's something to mention that you mentioned, is this idea of intentionality and shared purpose. Intentionality and shared purpose, in the sense of the intention being set to serve the needs of the community. And so we mentioned beneficiaries in some of the slides, even though that's a language we're trying to steer away from as we're trying to bring all of the key actors to the same level. But I think all of the examples that have informed this research are ones that in which actors have the intention to help a particular community, geographic or not, and all of the actors then share the purpose to improve the well-being and vitality of such communities, which I don't think would be a characteristic that would be present in the cartels and the patronage example. So that would be, one bit of answer, and I think this is the kind of principles we're trying to extract from the both positive and negative cases we're studying, but happy to discuss more.
Okay, before we move on to Mike, just really quick, when you have a second, to go back a couple of slides just to show what you wanted some responses on, so that folks can continue to think about that. I think there was a request in the chat for that.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
This one or the?
I think it was in the chat. I think it was.
Actually, this one.
It was what it was that you wanted sort of folks to.
I think it's where you were.
Yeah, the last slide.
The last slide, I think it's the very last
slide you had before the.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
There you go.
That leads into what I'm going to talk about.
Okay.
Actually, coming at a little similar to what Gustavo did. My initially, actually to civic wealth was something at a collective level rather than an individual project.
Yes.
Yes. And that's why I was a little surprised when I read what you were doing. I mean, that I was thinking it was going to be more about social capital. Civic wealth's a better term than social capital at the collective level. And I think so. I immediately started thinking about the kinds of implications that Lynn Ostrom's work would have had for that. And it's not so much in the particular cases that she's got in governing the commons. It's more her interest in polycentric governance and sort of going at this higher level of sort of community sort of thing. And I think that relates to what Gustavo was talking about. If you're doing this kind of entrepreneurship within a autocratic government with a lot of social connections and stuff like that, these projects are going to be fine for the people who are doing them or the group that they're serving, but they're not necessarily going to aggregate up to the communities and place sort of communities. And I think the way that's consistent with the way Lynn looked at sort of polycentric governance is to think more in terms of something like civil wealth being an infrastructure that different groups can draw upon to do the kinds of projects you're talking about. Okay, the kinds of projects you're talking about are sort of easier to pull off if you've already got some forums where different groups can get together, or if you've got a government that's used to, local government that's used to being engaged in entrepreneurship, and also twisting the arm of the entrepreneurs to make sure it doesn't ruin the downtown in order to serve this one group's project. For the Bree is a great example on that. Bree has a long tradition of that sort of stuff downtown and in their university, their college. So I think if you could think in terms of looking at civic wealth, both at a level of the individual project and at society as a whole, or the community, you're looking more into community, so that the civic sort of level of what that resources are. And that's where you would start to bring in a little bit more about the political institutions that are involved here. I understand why you're emphasizing the economic entrepreneurs and how that's often overlooked in this kind of bottom-up sort of approach. So that's very important in practice. I appreciate your connecting up. There's some sense of community that different groups are like a different disease group or something like that, or different kind of disability that you're trying to use for trying to get a particular project. I do health policy, so I think in terms of, sort of non-racially located, that's what I think about people who suffer from a certain kind of disease. But there's not a lot of politics in this. And I started out as a political scientist. And part of that infrastructure is whether the community has access, the community members have access to supportive mechanisms to build the kinds of projects that you're talking about. And to me, that's a better vision of what civic wealth is, or it's an aggregate level, whereas you're looking here at the individual project level. And so I'd love to talk to you more about that, but because I think you're onto something really important here that Lynn and Vincent would have liked a lot, because you've got a lot of co-production and institutional diversity and community-based. I mean, it's all sort of in there, but it's this distinction between the individual projects and whether this is good for the society as a whole, or the extent to which the kind of society you're in makes it less likely for the kind of problem you're dealing with to be as bad. Although you say, Brea, we cannot.
Well, the more I talk to folks there, the more I realize they do have these kinds of supporting mechanisms. There's a whole network of people that are trying to do something about this, maybe not always effectively, but they have what you're describing. And that's part of why they've been as successful as they have.
And yet somehow that one project got set up.
Well, and that was an arts project. There's also the whole Grow Appalachia thing that's going on. There's another whole thing around food that's going on there. But those same folks are involved in both networks in many cases. So
thank you so much for the great comment. Continue the conversation.
I'll have more sort of to this, but I really think you need to think about the aggregate level.
Yeah. See with that.
Thank you. I must say I haven't read your paper, so my comment may be just a little bit random, but I think this is fascinating that you're pushing boundaries of governance. That pushing is really something to speak on what is profit, what is money, what is income. All of these become fluid. You're not just talking about money, you're talking about social profits and things like that. So I think that's fascinating. Your principle number one about extra organizational civic wealth is fascinating in the sense if you, I'm sure you are very careful with based on what I hear, and although there's a trap here, a trap that Vincent would appreciate, which is a state-centric trap. Civic wealth, if civic citizen is defined just based on this membership of the nation state, that would not be rich enough for your theory that you're pushing for principle number one, right? And so there's a great example right now internationally, Burma, Myanmar, the entire population is against the group that capture the state seats and basically abusing and basically demolishing the state itself by exercising what it's doing against the population. So that wealth, that PDF, People Defense Forces, and CDM, the Civic and Civil Disobedient Movement, the citizens started striking since the coup, February 1st, 2021. I think that is the infrastructure I can plug in with your civic wealth sort of theory and bring it to understand what is the wealth that people in Burma are creating, right? And now they're doing against the state that is so abusive, right? Most states are abusive. So I think that is an important aspect that
Can I just respond to that?
Yes.
It's a very fair point, and as you can imagine, as we've gone through the process of developing this, we've from time to time have gotten feedback about or pushback about using the term citizen for exactly the reasons that you're saying, which is that if we're talking about citizen in a formal sense, there's a lot of people who get left out, or a lot of settings in which it's they're on the wrong side of these arguments, and so the citizen term is one that we chose, because we referring to it more generally as simply a member of one of these communities that is engaged in it. Likewise with the word civic, we know of course of its Western political roots, as a term, and yet we're using this sort of more shared responsibility and common bond notion of the, and that's why you can have something that's civic in a remote village in India. Yeah, it's not a place where we normally think of using the word civic, and yet we're trying to sort of.
So it's that idea. When you make a point about ownership, the term ownership, you kind of expanded that into not just economic, private kind of ownership, but ownership meaning I hear you as a belonging and participating and engaging, and that we own this room and we own this moment, right? Everybody owns a moment of this situation at this colloquium. And that type of ownership is not well defined in economic, right? Mm-hmm. And so that really led me to the second comment coming from this question is the infrastructure question, meaning what make these people, these citizens, or these members, or these belongers, right, engage actively? What drives them to that? So you mentioned interest being one, right? Interest would bring together, but there are issues, problems that they identify, not researchers, right? Issues identified by these belongers, or the participants, or these people who own the problem. And so I think that then requires moving from this economic term that you use, which is economy. If you use an Polanyian pre-industrial term, then you are right on. But if you're using economic and economy within the foundation of the capitalist post-industrial, post-enclosure movement, with privatization to the marketization, market taking over society, dislocating members of the community, right? So that's, I think, if you're going into that, I don't think this theory will work well. The work well is because your theory is so good. You should not really get trapped into this state-centric and market-centric thinking. And that double movement is locking in almost all intellectual endeavors that we are seeing. Mm-hmm. And so that trap is something that if you can avoid it in writing this, that would be really interesting.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, I think we have Diego and then.
Behind you, Jess, too. And I'm happy to get on it all the time. And if not, we can talk after.
Comments in the chat as well. So those are nice and recorded, and we'll try to add those in as well.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information with us. For me as an entrepreneur, it's really amazing to see all of these theories behind what you are doing. And my comments are regarding the model that you around explaining the kind of relations between the enterprise, the regiments, and the community. Mm-hmm. And I want to deep a little bit about your logics for grouping different elements like enterprises grouping for profit with non-profit and all of that. And also the regiments or the entities that fund all of that. And I am saying that because as an entrepreneur, I know that certain kind of structures requires and allows certain kind of either social or just as you say, money-based. For instance, for profit war, all of the elements that you do that is for money. Therefore, trying to generate social capital at the same level of the non-profit, not sure how the logics were there to just put in a group and create that. Similarly, there is also the structure of the legal structure or all of the logics behind that and how stakeholders interact with these structures that for a non-profit going to be economically sustainable makes, or even power relation sustainable, makes the enterprise very complex to create that. Yeah. Therefore, in that case, which are the logics to create that? Similarly, with the regiments of support, it's different when the government's money and the logics, power, leverage, all of that behind that when a private foundation or family foundation gives that. And as for instance, with your example of the arts, we can see, or we need to see more in depth, which was the people given the money, what were the real, what they were trying to do. Therefore, just understand a little bit the logic for that, and probably that is going to clarify a little bit the overcoming power differences that you were talking.
Okay, I'm happy to start. Yes, thank you. Maybe we can go back to the slide with the logics. Thank you for the great question. I'll answer in a few parts. First, let me say that we endeavored to propose a quite holistic framework or comprehensive framework under which the principles, a lot of examples of what we observed in social entrepreneurship would hold. And so I totally agree with you that, whereas a government or an impact investor or a high net worth family, all of which are represented under the regimes of support, may be entering a collaboration or, a cooperative collective action effort with different, mindsets and maybe different, kinds of intentions, because these are different birds, right? A government from a family. We think that they all respond to the logics of influence and control. They're all entering the collective action effort because they have the authority to commit some resources. They can be material resources. They can be, universities. I think we also have universities there that can provide, intellectual capital and advising on these initiatives. They're coming to the effort from that, from that standpoint. And this is the logic that guides their, their actions. That being said, and the same for all of, the other one, and I'm happy to go more in depth maybe after. That being said, and, it's just the two of us, a few doctoral students so far, I think looking at different kinds of examples where it's a family that connects with a social business in a community of rural Italy, because I know family business is huge, for instance, in Italy, the logics there might be refined. I think this holds true in general, but depending if it's a family with a social business, in a rural community in Italy versus a government with a nonprofit in, rural Africa, I think the logics could be refined by more empirical work, if that makes sense, right? So the different combinations that we outlay with, we have 10 examples of regimes of support, 5 examples of enterprise. If we mix them up, that may lead to more granularity. I think this still would hold, but I think empirically you may find, okay, logics of influence and control really is maybe, family, carrying on the family reputation and things like that, that could be refined.
Yeah, but there is also the element, I'm not sure, thinking ahead, like probably some combinations of that could create not civic wealth creation, could create other things because of this specific combination. That's part of the thinking that you have.
I mean, the way I'm taking your question, I think it brings us back to the first question, which was like, under which conditions, whatever combination of these three and their logics, what are the conditions under which civic wealth is created? So intentionality was, one. I think we just need to keep digging deeper.
And as Sophia said, it's clearly, it's a very big category.
Yeah.
We tried to make it, include, a wide range, and within that range, there are going to be different motivations and different backgrounds and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, these things don't happen without some of this kind of input, whether it's, in whatever form that it takes. And so, you can only oversimplify so much without, leaving some things off at the edges.
Okay, we have way more on our list than we have, and I'm trying to keep track of everyone.
We'll be more brief in the.
No, this is wonderful. But what might happen is after the next couple, we might start moving into sort of a lightning round. We have some really wonderful ones online as well. So maybe ask your question, and then Doc, I think you guys, and then we'll move online. Okay. Okay.
So thank you very much. So I want to relate to the first question by Gustavo. So I'm wondering what the role of external environment to, and creation of wealth and wealth creation. So under what conditions civic wealth creation can be maximized or go to the lowest level? Because actually in my dissertation, actually at IU, I studied about the government declining and citizen participation. Then usually I find out that when the government is going to decline, citizens likely to step in the public service provision, then they start to the co-production as well. So I'm wondering what's your idea about kind of role of external environment?
I think you could say the external environment is the impetus for a lot of this in many respects. I mean, we almost presented the example of Fogo Island in far eastern Newfoundland, which it's a whole story of together to try and rebuild their community because there was a big change in the fishing laws, and all of a sudden, the fisheries, these folks are not allowed to go out fishing anymore. We thought the fishing example would be good in the nostrum context. And so, that was a situation where the community was failing, was declining, and the people came together. So the external environment in that respect is sort of an impetus in many cases, or it may be not something that just happens, like in the case of a big industry leaves town and the community is trying to preserve itself, but also long-standing kind of structural problems that prevent, people because of longstanding roles from making moves that support creating community wealth. And so, I think it's a huge player in how these things manifest. That's a short answer, but.
Okay, can we move on to the lightning round for the in-room folks, and then we'll move to the lightning round for online folks. Okay, so Doc, and then.
I'll be quick. Love civic wealth creation, love all your work. Love that you include customers on the enterprise corner there, and want to let you know that Joyce over there in the orange coat and I, visiting scholars here, are working on a project called the Bloomington Byway, peer-to-peer e-commerce that starts with the notion that customers need to be active participants in entrepreneurship and that there should be peer-to-peer e-commerce. And it's early days for that, but we should talk.
Good, thank you. Great comment. Super lightning round comment. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Jody Smith, and I work in food systems and the sustainable food system science. And so we're in the very messy building of a statewide. So IU is an anchor institution. I'm sort of a student leadership position. I actually do the work, to create wealth for farmers and folks in the food system, values-based food systems, which we're sort of moving away from food for convenience and more into food as values. So like your Appalachian Food Network, same thing, geography being one value. And so we're in the midst of creating a collective action framework statewide for rooted in equity and all the messy things that go with leading with equity in food systems change. And so just for your examples or your work, we're in the middle of that messy business and doing it.
Thank you.
Actually, we think food and agriculture is a very important example in all of this.
There's a lot, I work with a lot of economic development people. It's all about jobs, but it's not about jobs. It's about wealth. And that concept is highly missed in our economic development personnel.
Very good.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch too. No more about the mess. I think the Ansler's online and then Brian Bruns. I
Yeah,
but I'd love for you to say it.
just a question that I put in the chat and building on what Mike said, I'm particularly interested in the role of rules on paper and rules in use, but particularly lately interstate preemption in the United States, in which states ban communities, specifically municipal governments, from doing a whole bunch of important things at the local and regional level. And these things include things like Tennessee, you can't have a municipal broadband utility or an energy utility. And in general, these laws are in the interest of big capital. And I'm just wondering, where in the model are you looking at law and rules as exogenous variables, as Lynn would have us do?
Just a quick answer. I don't know where to speak, which direction to speak in, but a quick answer is that there is in the regimes of support circle, you know, the notion of government officials and you know, they are in the business of enabling legislation from time to time. They also have policy authority, which releases money from time to time. But they also, sounds to me like from your example, they can be in the disabling business as well. But that is where in the model it shows up.
Brian, and then if we have time for, I think you're the last on the queue.
Okay, interesting stuff. My question is how you think about the distribution of benefits, even when it is all gains and win-win. I mean, we've had examples of negative impacts and so on, but just that if it's somebody may get the lion's share, or what kind of governance institutions and processes shape who benefits. And some of this gets talked about sometimes very simplistically as elite capture, but it faces real issues for outsiders intervening if it's not realistic to bypass local elites. But what forces is there contestation within elites, democratic accountability, other things that can make a difference in the distribution of the gains in this civic wealth kind of creation? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I don't know that I have a lightning answer to this.
Well, I do think it's a great question. And, you know, most of the examples that we look at, most of the things that have come from social entrepreneurship, you know, it's easy to identify it as, you know, well, they got a job, or they got a facility from which they can now sell their art, or they, you know, they got access to funding, right? But in terms of a set of created benefits that are then somehow distributed, we just haven't spent that much time on that. It's an enormously important question, but it's not something that we've really got a lot of insights to share at this point.
Right. So, I mean, besides, I would just add the one thing that came to mind was to think in terms of the different kinds of wealth I mean, there's a civic wealth, but also I'm thinking, you know, jobs created, economic empowerment of the cocoa bean, you know, farmers in Madagascar. This is their kind of share the benefits. Of course, the two Peace Corps as entrepreneurs, they're running this, you know, fairly profitable, even though that has had some, you know, some issues, social enterprise. So for them, it's like, I guess, a salary and perhaps, you know, some feel good effect. Like, I don't know, it's a huge question. Well, for real, right? That's the thing in the entrepreneurship space. That's
it is.
the main one.
Yeah. It's true. We haven't thought so much about pool of benefits that folks would share in. And so that's an important question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Technically, we were at 1 o'clock, but I would love maybe Dan on the queue, maybe we'll get his question and wrap it up.
Observation and question. The observation is looking through the figures in your paper. I don't see what's the difference between frameworks, models, and logics. And they all seem, especially the framework, seems underspecified. To me, it seems at such an abstract level. I don't know what the actual variables are, what the relations are between the variables, who the actors actually are. And so that leads to my question. What makes your framework superior for using in your situation than, say, just the IAD framework, using civic wealth creation as an evaluative criterion? More output.
You
don't have to answer.
I don't have a clear answer. It's a good question. We don't in no way is it a model. It doesn't model anything. And so it's more of a framework.
Call it a model.
We have. I know. But we're sensitive to the and you know, we used to say that, you know, the boxes and arrows would flow from this article. They're not in the article. And so I think we still essentially believe that. And as far as what are the variables, I mean, it's kind of the same to the answer to, you know, we tried to create something that would be you know, as applicable in urban Boston as it would in rural India. Right. And so you know, who fills in the blanks depends on the setting entirely. And so, you know, I'm not sure, based on that, I'm not sure we're making a strong claim around it being theory so much as it is a framework for analyzing.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying what makes it a better framework than ones that already exist.
Yeah, well, it's a valid question.
You're going to be here for several days, right?
Yeah.
You're here so I think, and Dan will be at the workshop, so it sounds like a really good conversation to continue. I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Joining us in for any of the comments from the chat, because we didn't